From Anshe Sfard Bethel Emeth Congregation, it's time to take 10 minutes for Torah with Rabbi Joel Finkelstein.
Welcome to our discussion of Parshat Emor, the other Shabbos. If we look in the Torah, really we find, says Rabbi Eli Baruch Shulman of Yeshiva University, we find two different Shabboses, two different Sabbaths, two different descriptions of what Shabbos is all about. In the very description of Shabbat, in the Ten Commandments themselves, we find two totally different descriptions. The first commandments, in the first commandments, we keep the Shabbat because 6 days God created, 7th day God rested. In the second commandment, that the idea of Shabbat is so the slaves should rest, and we should remember that we were slaves in Egypt. So two Sabbaths. One Sabbath related to creation. The other Sabbath related to the Exodus from Egypt. These two Sabbaths express themselves and find expression in this Parshat Emor. You see, in Parshat Emor, it has the Parshat HaMoadim. This section contains the story of all the different holidays. Now, in describing and introducing the holidays, it says, the holidays of God that you should call, these are the holidays. And it includes Shabbat. Really? Shabbat is included in the holidays? But then it says, these are the holidays that you should call holidays. So we get to determine the calendar date of each holiday based on the moon. These are the holidays, and it starts with Pesach, and it goes through Shavuos, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot, Shmini Atzeret, and that does not include the Shabbat. As a matter of fact, at the end of the Parsha, it says, these are the holidays aside from the Shabbatot. Now, these are the holidays aside from which are the Shabbos of God. In other words, these holidays do not include Shabbat. So is Shabbat included in the holiday list or not? On the one hand, it's bracketed out. It's in the beginning, it's in the introduction, but it's not in the body of the holidays. It's mentioned at the end that these holidays are holidays aside from Shabbat, which is also a holiday, but it's not included in this section. So is Shabbat included or not? Well, that depends. Which Shabbat are we talking about? If you speak of Shabbat as commemoration of the Exodus from Egypt, it's the day on which slavery is abolished. We have no slaves on Shabbat. You can't tell your slave to pick up that book and put it over there. On Shabbat, that's forbidden. There's no slavery on Shabbat. Shabbat is to remember that we were slaves. In that sense, Shabbat is part of the holidays. But when you speak of Shabbat as remembering the creation of the world, in that sense, it's not connected to the holidays. You see, the holidays are very much connected with the Exodus, because Pesach is the Exodus holiday. The last day of Pesach, perhaps connected to the splitting of the sea, as part of the Exodus. The Shavuot is connected to the getting of the Torah as part of the Exodus. The Sukkot is commemorate that we dwelt in Sukkot, or the clouds of glory, as we left Egypt. These holidays are deeply connected to the Exodus from Egypt. But Shabbat has a dual element. One element of Shabbat has nothing to do with the Exodus. Therefore, if we look at our Kiddush, says Rabbi Shulman, you look at the Kiddush on Friday night, in some ways, the beginning of the Kiddush, the first paragraph is all about creation. Vayechulu hashamayim. In the second paragraph, we mention that in fact, God created the world. Zikaron l'maseh Breshit, a remembrance of Genesis. But on the other hand, Kiddush is part of something else. Says Rabbi Shulman, Kiddush is part of the meal. You see, the meal is a fulfillment of the verse in Isaiah that Karat al Shabbat Oneg, that should be enjoyment on Shabbat. Who says? Does it say in the Torah that you should enjoy yourself on Shabbat? No, it doesn't really say that. Unless we look more carefully. If we look, certainly in Isaiah you'll find enjoying Shabbat, but also if you look in the Torah itself, in Parshat Beshalach, when it talks about the man, that the man falls twice on Friday. Why? Double portion for Shabbat. So all of a sudden we see that Shabbat is a day when you prepare for it, whatever you bake, whatever you cook. There's an idea of Shabbat as a day, not just commemoration of some theological event. Shabbat as a day of eating and rejoicing. Karadal Shabbat Oneg, Isaiah introduces this second element, which is really there, it's hidden in the Torah, the element of enjoying Shabbat. Kiddush is part of that enjoyment of Shabbat. In that way, Shabbat and Pesach are very similar. Pesach is, let's rejoice because we got out of Egypt. We're now B'nai Chorin, we're free. We have a chiyuv, an obligation of cherut, of things that express freedom, like drinking the 4 cups of wine and reclining and dipping, things that reflect freedom. Well, what is Shabbat? Shabbat also commemorates that we used to be slaves, but we're not slaves anymore, so we need to rejoice. And therefore, the Shabbat and Pesach are similar. Perhaps that answers the famous puzzle. How come the Torah says that Mimacharat Shabbat, even HaKohen, that when do you start counting the Omer? When do you wave the Omer? The day after Shabbat. Shabbat? Well, you mean the day after Pesach? Which Shabbat? So we say that word Shabbat means Pesach. Why does the Torah refer to Shabbat, to Pesach as Shabbat? The answer is because Pesach and Shabbat have an overlap. They're juxtaposed in our parsha. The first of the holidays, the first of the different list of holidays, Pesach, Shabbat, they're at the beginning. Because Shabbat and Pesach both commemorate the freedom from Egypt. More broadly speaking, we know that, yes, Shabbat was originally ordained to be a commemoration of the creation of the world. But we know that when God relates to us, He doesn't relate to us as the creator of the world. He doesn't say, I am the Lord your God who created you. No. We don't relate to creation. It was prehistoric. We don't know how it happened, when it happened. It was Bereshit bara Elokim. Somehow it happened. Big bang, big shmang. Somehow it happened at some point. What we do know, as part of not prehistory, but history, is that the Jewish people were formed. Egypt came to the land of Israel. We know that God took us out of Egypt. That's something God can say, that's me. I took you out of Egypt. I did it for you. You owe me something. You have a relationship with me. I have a relationship with you. And therefore, that's true. Not only the 10 Commandments begin with the Exodus and not with creation, but it's true Shabbat as well. That the element of Exodus in some ways supplanted or replaced the element of creation. Because ultimately, we can't keep a holiday, we don't observe in this world because of creation. It's too far removed. We observe Shabbat because God took us out of Egypt. It's a day to remember. Stop. It's a day to remember that God, yes, He created us, but He took us out of Egypt and He asked us not to think that we are the masters over the universe. We're God's slaves. We do what He says, and we're not masters over others. That on Shabbat we recognize that there is no slavery. Remember that we got out of slavery. Remember that the ultimate goal is to be slaves of God and that no one should be our slaves. This is the idea of the dual aspect of Shabbat. Shabbat has these two elements found in Beshalach, found here. And actually, if we ask ourselves, why do we usually read the extra verses on holidays? We read a couple of verses before the holiday section. Because Rabbi Shulman says there, it mentions that God took us out of Egypt. The introduction to all these holidays is that God took us out of Egypt. That's the framework for all the holidays, including Shabbat. Thank you for joining us here at the Anshe Sfar Beth Elameth congregation for our discussion of Shabbat and the two aspects of Shabbat. Join us each week for our discussions of the Parsha and the various holidays. And thanks to Jason Lefkowitz for producing today's show. Thank you.
This has been 10 Minutes for Torah with Rabbi Joel Finkelstein. To learn more, visit ASBEE.org.